Okay, welcome to Future Utopia or Tacitly Terrifying, the panel where we are going to talk about how sometimes the amazing things that we see in our science fiction futures are actually a little scary when you start to think about them. I am Jennifer Povey. I will be moderating this panel. I am honoured and a little saddened to be here right now because originally this panel was to be moderated by the wonderful Don Sakers, who sadly passed away 2 weeks ago. The show will go on in his honour. I would like to start by having my panelists introduce themselves and maybe say something about why you're on this panel. Bud? You're muted.
Yeah, John, you're muted.
It's better that way.
Hey, I like to hear your voice.
I'm Buzz Sparhawk. I'm a short fiction writer mostly. I've published about maybe around 150 short stories and in various places, 3 novels, and I'm on the panel because I volunteered.
And Doc?
I'm Doc Coleman. I'm a steampunk author. I've also, because of my interest in steampunk and my day job work as an IT professional, I'm always looking at the technology, and honestly, as a sci-fi fan, a lot of sci-fi is how taking the technology to its ultimate ends actually ends up somewhat horrific rather than somewhat wonderful. So that's the approach I'm taking to this panel.
And Elora?
Hello, I'm Elora. I am one of the many techs and volunteers who helped make Balticon happen or run as well as possibly can. And I'm on this panel. I mainly volunteered to help run the panel, and you know, here I am.
Okay, awesome. And I am Jennifer Povey. I am a writer of science fiction and fantasy, a long-term fan, and very interested in certain aspects of this topic. And yes, thank you, Elora. Thank you to all the tech crew. So let's start by asking my panelists. So we're talking about something that's utopian or futuristic, but really also kind of scary. What's your favorite example of this?
I think, well, as you can see, I have a background from Destiny 2, from Europa, where you can see Jupiter behind my head. Basically, I think the whole utopia of like wanting to find like a new planet to like colonize, to you know, be hopeful for the future of humanity and all that, but also some of the lengths that people will go to achieve their goals or to, like, to preserve their own legacy instead of helping humanity. Honestly, it's been really disturbing, and it's like, this is supposed to be peaceful, it's supposed to be happy, and then it turns out, oh god, this is actually really terrifying. Like, what have some people done? What have some people done to achieve these goals? It's just kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies.
Okay, Doc?
The one that gets me is looking at things like the Altered Carbon universe, where your personality and your memories can be recorded digitally, and you know, while you can be thrown into computer simulations where you don't have a body at all, or you could be on ice for hundreds of years before you get into a body, and I find that the whole concept kind of terrifying because it undermines the sense of identity. Are you a person, or are you a computer program? If it also creates a world where if somebody needs your body, they can just take it. Because you're backed up, you're fine. We're taking your body and putting somebody else's personality into it for a while. It really kind of fundamentally interferes with the whole concept we have of the sense of self.
Which is why altered carbon is cyberpunk, because that's a major theme of cyberpunk.
I think one of the things that I deal with in most of my short fiction is the immediate future. And it says it's unintended consequences. What happens if on there? And I've used that in a number of things. I had an analog story that I posited a near future in which advertisements were displayed on the walls of the man's showers. His shoes sang to him as he hiked, as he walked, all sorts of inventive things, like clothes that were temperature sensitive, whole list of things. And what happened, it took 2 months after it was bought before it was published. And in that time, everything I just mentioned was already in development or existed. So it's a real difficult writing about extending something into the near future and trying to guess what's going to happen.
And I will say that mine is Star Wars. Fascism is bad. Slavery is bad. Racism is bad. Owning sentient machines is perfectly fine. And it's never well addressed. Which brings me to my second question, which is works that actually lean into this and use it. We've already mentioned altered carbon, which is cyberpunk, and cyberpunk is all about scary promises of potentially utopian technology. So do we have any other things that we could bring up that actually lean into this idea and make use of it as to create conflict and tell a story? Maybe we'll start with Elora.
I would think for utopian, for future utopia and all, what basically the whole thing that kind of sits in the back of my head is what lengths will someone go to achieve this utopia? How far is someone really going to go to get what they want in the end? How corrupted must your morals be in order, to do whatever you want to do to get this perfect utopia? Or a utopia is nice and all, but there's also, you gotta think of also people who don't want that utopia, who kind of always see war and strife. But it's also what basically do the means, something about means to the end and all.
Justify the ends by the means.
Yeah, something like that. The means, basically, does the end justify the means? That's what I'm thinking of.
Well, I think one of the things that we always have to remember is, yes, tomorrow's problems are today's solutions.
Yeah. Very, very often true.
Yes.
Very often true. Oh, we'll fix this issue. Oh, we will fix the issue of big data by creating these wonderful AI algorithms that will process all of it. Oh, they're racist. Because the data that's being put into them is biased, and we discovered that algorithms can be biased in horrible ways sometimes. Just as a note, I am kind of glancing at the chat, but if you have actual questions you want the panel to address, please put them in the Q&A, because if they are in the chat, we probably will not see them. The chat just moves too quickly. So please put your actual questions in the Q&A. Okay, Doc?
Let's see. The thing that I remember is that by its nature, a utopian story is going to show you the image of a perfect world, and then it's going to show you how it's not perfect. So these kind of things always show up. I mean, you look at things like was the island, where you have these people that have this structured, protected environment, and they're all in like some unspoken competition to perform well, and you could be chosen to go to this grand paradise, and it turns out that all of these people are clones of wealthy people, and they're just there in storage until their organs are needed in order to revive somebody. And they're not going to a paradise, they're going to be taken apart because somebody needs a spleen or a liver or what have you. There's pretty much always something shady behind the curtain.
I mean, fortunately, I do not believe we will ever have clone farms, because I believe it will be much cheaper and easier just to clone the organs when you need them, fortunately.
That I'll agree with. And that's if we don't come up with a way of just bioprinting them.
Right, exactly. I think we are very, very close to being able to simply make whatever organs somebody needs on demand, which I think will be amazing, because that goodbye organ shortages, goodbye people being pressured to donate a kidney. But we'll probably find some downside to it.
It's hard keeping track of the chat and the Q&A both going.
Yeah, I will answer it. I am monitoring the questions. So what about something that really should be explored and would be a really good story that really hasn't been? I mean, in Star Trek, they do explore some of the scary aspects of the transporters, like people get duplicated, Kirk gets split into a good twin and an evil twin, which was absolutely ridiculous and cheesy, but kind of entertaining. But what do you feel that various franchises could address for a good story that's in this area that really either hasn't been done or has been done poorly?
You brought up transporters, so one of the ones that's been in my mind for a long time is everyone just kind of assumes that, okay, you get onto a pad here, you're taken apart, you're reassembled at the destination, you're the same person. What I'd really love to see is a story where you have a culture that says, okay, you get here, you are destroyed. A duplicate of you is created at the new destination. So that is a new incarnation of you. It is not the same person. It is a new person with all the same memories. Just to see a cultural reaction to that. Even more interesting would be to see that in a culture that has some form of ancestor worship. So the you that stepped onto the pad and got destroyed is now one of your ancestors that you can pray to. I would love to see a story like that. Not quite so much that I'm willing to take time out of my schedule to write it, but
That's the issue, isn't it? Can we use that to escape the law, or could it be used as a way to have the death penalty without really having the death penalty because there's still a new version of that person?
Oh Lord, and what does it do to inheritance? and property?
Rogue Moon by August Budris. It's all about duplicative teleportation. I don't think I ever actually got around to that one. And I think we kind of answered Larry's question too.
Looking at the first question here about the drawback to universal translators, and my mind immediately went to the Saturday Night Live sketches where they had the guy from Poland who had a very, very, very cheap copy of a translation, and everything he said was completely nonsense with relation to what he intended.
Yeah, I mean, horrible drawback to universal translators. There's actually been a meme circling on a conversation on Tumblr lately about things the universal translator shouldn't translate. And how does the universal translator know not to, for example, translate Targ as dog? Because they feel very similar societal roles, but they're very different animals. And the universal translator generally appears to know not to translate Targ, because a Targ is a specific thing. But, mistranslation stories are a trope, but what can anyone else think of that would be a horrible drawback to having a universal translator?
I think one of the drawbacks is that the use of metaphor and simile in there, where the words are literally not what you intend. They refer to something else. And they have a second meaning. And it's not anybody listening to it except whatever's translating it.
And the idioms too, like sometimes, like for when even in present day, like in present day, like some idioms don't in one language don't exactly translate well in another language.
So what I think is actually more interesting is the promise of the universal translator is that other people, everyone can understand each other. And the drawback of the universal translator is that everybody can understand each other. And this wrecks diplomacy. Because diplomacy is all about giving someone an impression without necessarily telling them what you want. Just the idea that you have complete and total communication. And in some ways, people have tried to do this with the concept of telepathy. The idea that you can't lie in telepathy. And that's when you start realizing all of the social constructs we have where you need to lie. And it's like, your wife says, "Oh, I'd like to match this dress," and it's like, yes, you do, but I can't tell you that because we've got to get going.
So, yeah, I'd like to actually just say what Thomas said in the Q&A. Douglas Adams said that the Babelfish, by removing all barriers to communication, had caused more and bloodier wars than anything else in creation. And I will also point out that dogs, cats, and horses, which are social creatures that don't have an advanced language, all lie.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
They all lie. Lying is actually a required part of social interaction. It's how you don't get into fights. Sometimes you have to lie, and it's something that we've been doing since before we have language if we look at other social animals. So let's move on from the universal translator and move to my last question, which is, I think we've already touched on this. What do you want to what would you like to see to really play with this sort of ambiguity of utopia, and of course thinking of Ursula K. Le Guin and how she described the dispossessed as her ambiguous utopia. What would you like to see done? The cat might have an answer.
I think so. Like how the cat keeps falling out.
The cat teleported.
Yes. Yes. And cat, it seems like the cat may have some insight.
The cat may have some insight. I think the cat just wants to be, the cat just wants all this attention that's being put.
Mm-hmm.
Fine Cheshire breed, yes.
But you mentioned teleporting. I think there's so much about the ability to teleport that is considered convenient. That I think most people just look at the convenience of moving the story along and don't spend a lot of time talking about all the problems that it creates. In fact, the only story that I can think of that actually dealt with this was Schlock Mercenary, the webcomic, where one of the members of the mercenary company comes up with a new method of teleporting ships from one place to another. Instead of using these huge, power-hungry stargates to move ships across solar systems, he comes up with a method that basically uses trillions of tiny worm gates to disassemble the ship and reassemble it on the other side, and ends up starting a whole series of wars because he's broken the monopoly of the race that had these big worm gates in the first place. And also now the problem is not only can you move whole ships, you can move bombs, missiles. You can, why bother with targeting when I can just teleport a bomb onto your command deck and detonate it?
Or teleport a biological sample of a virus onto your command deck, kill everyone, and then just take the ship.
Yep.
I know, I'm awful.
No, nah, that would actually make sense, like teleporting a bioweapon and then basically, hey, you get a free ship out of the deal.
Yeah.
So they said take the newly contaminated ship. You're vaccinated. They don't have, it's something you have the vaccine against because you developed it. So you're immune.
Well, that's the very first thing that they had to develop after developing the teleportation technology was a way to block it.
Yes.
One of the things that is coming along with the advanced robots that have a modicum of intelligence and whatnot is that they play on humans' empathetic side. People name their vacuum cleaners, for example. They take ownership. They treat them like they were pets. There's an amusing story about the Army was trying a tactical weapon. It was basically a surveillance thing. It had 6 legs. And they said it also can find mines. And they set it loose in a minefield. It went a few steps and bam, so it exploded and it blew a leg off. Went a few more steps, wham, it blew a second leg off. Went a few more steps and bam, it blew a third leg off. And the general turned around and said, for God's sake, stop it.
I mean, a lot of times humans will pack bond with anything.
We will. I mean, soldiers who have to work with bomb disposal robots get really upset when those things get blown up. And we all cried over a robot that ran out of power on Mars. We are ridiculous with our pack bonding. This is just, and it's part of what's made us such a successful species, because we can just use the evolutionary adaptations of other species like they're almost our own.
that's really interesting to look at in light of the Frankenstein's syndrome, in that we're afraid that we're going to create something which will then decide that we're a waste of space and go and eliminate us.
Yeah.
But the fact that we bond so strongly with the things that we create, and we've already shown that when we try to build artificial intelligences, we feed them our biases and our opinions so that they continue those. That we're much more likely to get artificial intelligences that that bond back to us, that pick up that same trait of anthropomorphizing and bonding with things. And the only way that we're really going to screw that up is if we abuse them. Like in the Star Wars universe, where, okay, droids are sentient, but they're also property. And you could pick up a droid on the street and put a locking bolt on it, and now it's yours.
This makes me think of in Destiny 2, like one of the famous AIs, his name is Rasputin. And and yes, the whole thing of the song Rah, Rah, Rasputin and all that. But and it's like where the lore is now, and it's just like, I don't want anything to happen to Rasputin. I like this AI. And you can't understand what he's saying because Rasputin speaks Russian, or technically Old Russian in the scope of the game, but it's like, you don't want anything happen to Rasputin. You like him. And one of the missions, the comment is, there's so few ballet fans left. And pretty much you can program, what you like, if you like ballet, if you like musicals and all that, you could program it into the AI, and then the AI turns around and decides that they like it too. And it's like, oh no, don't let the AI die. Please, for God's sake, don't let it die.
Okay, so we have two questions, and the first one's a pretty good one. Doc had it right. This is from Virginia. Speculative fiction is exactly the way to explore these issues. How about turning it around and looking more at things that sound horrible and exploring how they might be good? Maybe that's next year's panel, but let's have some quick thoughts on that right now.
Yeah, like you said, Jen, that would be a good panel for next year. Oh, because that's cats. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank at the moment.
Okay, I can jump in. I mean, we touched on cloning a little bit earlier, and we talked about cloning specific organs for replacements. But the other aspect of that is, okay, if you can grow specific kinds of tissue, then meat is no longer murder, because you can take samples from cows, bison, what have you, and grow those cells in a lab. Retire the animals to some kind of nature preserve, but you could still have continuous supplies of meat. And because it's cloned, that also opens up avenues for space travel and colonization, that you can continue to produce food on ships while you're in transit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I would want to live in a world where we didn't have any cows. But
I didn't say kill all the cows. I said don't kill the cows for meat. Let them live.
But
you always want a control group.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is the unintended consequences there as well. Now we don't need to feed all these animals, we'll just kill them. That's the potential unintended consequence. Because I'm sorry, I'm still in independent consequence mode. So let's try and go back to something that sounds horrible but might be good. Bud, do you have anything?
Well, I just answered a question on there. Somebody said weapons that you could set on stun. And I added, yes, and they should have bayonets. There's some horrible ideas there. I mean, that would be a terrible weapon to use against somebody in a vehicle.
Yeah. And there was actually a Star Trek novel, I forget which one, where somebody stunned members of the species that don't sleep. And it actually really messed them up.
Oh.
But unfortunately, I don't remember which one it is. I just remember that they had to do that they all got kind of mentally thrown off, and they had to do this thing to reset their brains so that they would be okay again, because apparently this species, because they don't sleep, they don't do well with being knocked unconscious, and they're stuff going on in their brain that had to be fixed.
Well,
and the other thing with using stun weapons against something the physiology of which you don't know is always going to be risky.
Well, in Larry Niven's Known Space, they invented a non-lethal weapon called a TASP that would let you stimulate the pleasure centers of someone's brain remotely. And so someone would be walking around, somebody pulls the trigger, and it's like they had the most amazing feeling in the world. And the problem was that it became addictive.
Yeah.
That once somebody got hit with one of these weapons, that they might seek it out. They might actually go and have surgery and have electrodes set to the pleasure centers of their brain, so that they could have that feeling constantly.
And there were also other uses of that we are too early in the day to discuss.
Yeah.
So, Sylvan, isn't the idea of flying cars scary? How do they get regulated? Where do you put traffic signs?
Yeah, that we keep thinking about using all that empty space for traffic instead of using the ground, but we've already got enough problems with people flying planes into buildings and mountains. If you start doing flying cars, then you've got a lot more potential missiles to misdirect. And that's especially difficult with American attitudes towards their vehicles. Because for so many people, your vehicle is independence. Yet in order to make flying cars work, you've got to have some kind of centralized traffic control that manages things, which means somebody who's not in your vehicle is controlling your vehicle. And that opens up a whole different box of problems.
And I mean, the issue with self-driving cars that we need to work out how to address is people hacking them.
Yep.
People hacking a rich guy's self-driving car and driving him somewhere and holding him to ransom, for example. And we already are dealing with siegeware and ransomware, and already the Internet of Things is amazing, but there's some consequences there.
I think one of the things about is you have to keep in mind is most of the food we eat, animal food we eat, is not natural. Cows aren't natural. Pigs, as they exist now, are not natural. If anybody's seen a real feral pig, it's a far cry from what you see on a farm. Most of them, I can't think of anything that isn't game that we eat.
Yeah.
30 to 50 feral hogs.
Yeah, somebody had to
Forget what the point I
mention
was trying to make.
feral hogs. But on the other hand, we've co-evolved with these species for so long that but a question from Thomas, why would you ever use deadly force if you had stun weapons?
Because stun weapons, if you're using them against something you've never seen before, that could kill them. You wouldn't know it until after you use them.
Right. But I mean, I think he means why does anyone on Star Trek ever set their phases to kill?
Well, that answer is easy. They set their phasers to kill because stun didn't do anything. But even if you posit a world where stun is effective, then why would you use deadly force? Part of it is that while stun might be effective against living things, sometimes you also have to destroy material. And if looking at something like Star Trek, or like phasers in Star Trek, well, the kill settings are effective for destroying material. And honestly, especially if you're dealing with a war situation, can you imagine fighting a war with stun weapons? You know, you get the jump on the enemy, you stun a bunch of their troops, now you've got a ton of prisoners. And you're going to have to feed and clothe and shelter these people until the war is resolved.
Need I remind you about the bayonets?
Well, that's still you're end up using a lethal weapon. It's like, are you going to use the stun weapons to incapacitate the enemy and then slit their throats? Is that any better or worse than shooting them outright?
I mean, I think that meaningful, effective stun weapons would probably, and that's probably another panel, is the effect of actual non-lethal as opposed to less lethal, which is what we have now, weapons on warfare and on how disputes get settled. And do you end up in a war of flowers situation where you're basically settling everything with a paintball match? Do you get... So
Well,
yeah, non-lethal weapons are more for policing. Yeah.
We have a variety of stun weapons called a beanbag loader, shotgun, and they can be used. They can be highly effective. Unfortunately, they can only be effective against individuals, not a crowd.
Yeah.
But it definitely would be interesting to look at the social ramifications of a society going to only non-lethal weaponry, and what happens when you've got something that you think is non-lethal and then you use it on someone and they die. Like if you have an immobilizing foam that you use on a crowd and then someone ends up suffocating in the foam.
I mean, we are already dealing with that.
Yeah.
People die from being tased. You pepper spray somebody and they turn out to be allergic to pepper and go into anaphylactic shock and die. Which has happened.
Yeah.
That's why the correct term is less lethal, not non-lethal, because we do not have a true non-lethal weapon that you can absolutely guarantee won't kill somebody.
Well, but the point, part of the point is that we're currently in a society that finds lethal use of force acceptable to a certain degree. But if you're talking about a society that is completely committed to non-lethal uses of force to the exclusion of anything lethal, then what happens when things start happening and you have accidents and people die?
We also should not forget that you have to have a lot of social constructs around using non-lethal weapons. Somebody has to stay dead and act as if they're dead, even though they haven't been killed.
which was sort of my joke about paintball matches where
Yeah,
you
exactly.
have, but
Exactly.
about games where you have rules where if you were dead, you are supposed to act as if you were dead. Paintball games and certain rule sets of laser tag too.
Mm.
So I don't see any more questions, but I did see something in the chat earlier that was an interesting comment, if I can find it. An interesting question that I tried that they didn't put in the Q&A, if I can find it. Where-
Part. There was a question in the QA that I noticed.
Yeah, there was a follow-up about beef, cow milk, and cloned meat.
And what happens to hens when they're done laying eggs? What happens to hens when you can scan an egg and replicate it infinitely? Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, somebody wanted to ask about the TARDIS.
Oh
about
yeah.
TARDIS being able to destroy the universe.
Yes.
Okay. I'm not exactly sure where that reference came from. I can only think it came from the
It came from the panel description.
right. Well, how it got into the panel description. That it came from the Big Bang episode in Matt Smith's Run as the Doctor, where, but as I recall, that was not the actual universe; it was a pocket universe. But
Right.
I don't know. But it does bring. Yeah, it was the Big Bang and Pandorica opens, or vice versa. But it does bring a question of, what do you do when you have technology, especially transportation, that would require such large power demands that in order to power them, you then have an incredible destructive energy
Right.
that could be devastating on a planetary scale.
Well, I mean, canonically, the Time Lords created a controlled singularity. They actually did blow up a solar system to create the Eye of Harmony.
Mm-hmm.
Presumably one that nobody was using, but we are still talking about blowing up a solar system to create a power source. That is pretty destructive. Anyone else have any comments about the TARDIS?
No, I'm sorry. My brain is just.
It's fine. It's fine. It's
I haven't had enough
the last day of
caffeine.
the con.
I haven't had enough caffeine yet.
Yeah.
So Danny's posted a pair of questions.
Yeah, I was going to get to those. Don't worry. I did see them. I was just seeing if Bud had any opinions on the TARDIS.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see the questions too. Drink it till your liver gets up, then get a new one.
No.
That's just the problem with that is like that can still lead to bad behaviors because yeah, you can continually replace your liver, but at what cost to the rest of your body?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the point Danny is trying to make is that if you can grow a replacement organ relatively quickly in the lab, anytime you need one, are you going to do stupid does this mean people are going to do stupid stuff? Or more stupid stuff than they already do?
This makes me think of Repo, the genetic opera.
I never saw that.
Yeah.
There's a question here of what happens to hens when they're done laying eggs. Coming from a farm, I would say they become fodder for the stew pot.
Right. Except for people who, you know, have their free hens in the backyard and just get more and let the old ones retire, which, you know, some people are nice and let their hens retire.
So in terms of if you're can replace organs easily, does that lead to more careless behavior? It's like, well, yes, because we already have tons of people who indulge in careless behavior and do so. Now you've just increased the survivability of each of those people. So if they've gone out and done something once, and you know it costs them like a couple days in the hospital to recover, well, they'll feel fine afterwards. So they'll probably go out and do it again, or do something else stupid in a different way.
And it'll cost you an arm and a leg.
Yeah. And you'll get those back, and maybe you'll decide that eventually that the thrills aren't worth the hospital trips and you'll stop.
But yeah, I mean, how do you as a society discourage that kind of behavior? I mean, do you make each subsequent organ replacement cost a little bit more?
That would probably make sense in that case if you could easily replace like damaged limbs and organs or whatever, make it cost prohibitive. Like, yeah, sure, go out, be an idiot, YOLO and all that. But the next time you do this, it's going to cost you more. And then scale up the costs from there.
Of course, the issue with that is then you've got equity and, you know, insurance, and then also you've got people who are working very dangerous jobs who may need more. So yeah, and another bad side effect that Jesse just brought up is exactly related to that. If you can easily replace, and this is kind of touched on in the Expanse a little with limb replacement, employers going, okay, if we can replace your hand, then we don't need all those machine guards to keep your fingers from getting cut off because we'll just grow them back. So what do you think about that as a concern?
Honestly, that kind of calls back to like for the Industrial Revolution, for like before all the safety things were in place. Like, it's often been, I've heard it often said that a lot of the regulations we have in place, those were written in blood.
They were.
And if you eliminate those regulations, what's it going to take to make sure those regulations stay in place? How much blood must be paid as a price to keep those in place? Or if they're eliminated, to put them back in place so you're not losing parts, or you're not ending up with people who, yeah, they can like regenerate or regrow, like, you know, fingers and whatever, but what's the side effects of that? Like, what does that come with?
Yeah. Okay, so we are almost out of time. So we can continue this discussion in, which room are we in? I keep losing track of that.
In water table.
Water table, okay.
Water table.
Continue the discussion in water table. I would like my panelists to just briefly say, you know, where can we find you? Do you have any last words?
All right, I will go first. I just dumped links to all my stuff in the chat. As always, you can find me at doccoleman.com or search for my books on Amazon by searching for Coleman Steampunk. I think the real thing to remember here is that whatever technology we're looking like, it's going to have good ramifications and bad ramifications. And it really depends on how the culture wants to choose what it emphasizes.
Okay. Elora?
I am posting links to my fanfics and to my Twitter
Awesome.
in the chat. Like I said, I am one of the many techs who helps make con run or function the best way we know how. And yeah, and this has been my first Balticon where I am a panelist.
Awesome. And Bud?
I just put up my website and my blog site on there. So anybody that's interested in my random thoughts are welcome to look at either one of them. Also, I have a list of all my publications there.
Which is a pretty long list. And I just posted what I think is my most relevant book for this panel in the chat. So you can find my work there and click through to my author page and see what else. And this was my last panel of the con, but I will be around on Discord and we can take the discussion to water table for any other thoughts people might have.
Like the horrible consequences of Zoom.
What are the horrible consequences of Zoom? Getting your cat filter stuck in a serious legal meeting. Thank you to my panelists. Thank you to my audience. Thank you to Tech. This has been absolutely great. And next year, hopefully I will see all your wonderful faces in Baltimore. Let us hope.
Yes, fingers crossed.
Peace.
Peace.